Think your school is safe, think again. What if the lockdown hit something far darker? These true stories will haunt every hallway you remember. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Jessica Turner walked through the empty corridors of Blackwood Academy. Her footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to follow her wherever she went. As the new night security guard, she had volunteered for the graveyard shift, thinking it would be easy money watching over an empty school building. How wrong she was. The academy had been closed for 3 months now, ever since the incident that nobody wanted to talk about. The school board had been very clear during her hiring. Do not ask questions about what happened here. Just make sure nobody gets inside who shouldn't be there. Jessica adjusted her flashlight and checked her watch. 12:15 in the morning. Still 7 hours and 45 minutes until sunrise. She had already completed 2 rounds of the building, checking every classroom, every storage room, every possible entry point. Everything seemed normal, if you could call a completely empty school normal. But then she heard it. A soft crackling sound coming from somewhere above her head. She looked up and noticed the old intercom speaker mounted on the wall. The red light was flickering on and off, like a dying heartbeat. Crackle, crackle. Static filled the hallway, bouncing off the walls and creating an unsettling chorus of white noise. Jessica had worked security at office buildings before, and she knew that intercom systems didn't just turn themselves on. Someone somewhere in this building was at the main control panel. But that was impossible. She had the only set of keys. She had checked every single door, every single window. The building was completely secure. The static stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Jessica's heart began to pound as she realized she was no longer alone in Blackwood Academy. Click. The intercom system activated with a sharp mechanical sound that made Jessica jump. Then came a voice, distorted and strange, like someone speaking through water. Attention students and faculty. Please remain calm and proceed to your designated safe zones immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Jessica's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. It was Principal Morrison, the man who had disappeared 3 months ago, right before the school was shut down. But Principal Morrison was dead. She had seen the newspaper articles, police reports. His body had been found in the basement of this very building. The announcement continued, but now there was something different about the voice. It was getting deeper, more distorted with each word. All students must report to the gymnasium for immediate evacuation. Do not use the elevators. Do not go to the basement levels. Whatever you do, do not look in the mirrors. Jessica's flashlight began to flicker. The batteries were fresh. She had just put them in before her shift started. But now the light was growing dim, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. She needed to get to the main office to find the source of these announcements. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. Every classroom door she passed was now slightly open, even though she had specifically checked to make sure they were all locked. "Attention, Jessica Turner," the voice said, and Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. The announcements were now personal. "Please report to room 237 immediately. Your presence is required for the final ceremony." Room 237. Jessica remembered that room from her orientation. It was supposed to be permanently closed, sealed off after what the previous security guard had told her was a gas leak. But Jessica was beginning to suspect that the real reason was something far more sinister. As she approached the staircase leading to the second floor, every light in the hallway began to flicker simultaneously. The intercom crackled to life again, but this time the voice was different, younger, more frightened. "Help us," whispered a child's voice. "We're still here. We never left." Then another voice joined in. "The doors won't open." And another. "It's getting colder." Soon, the intercom was filled with a chorus of children's voices, all speaking at once, all begging for help. Jessica realized with growing horror that these were the voices of students. Students who had been here 3 months ago when whatever happened at Blackwood Academy took place. But they were supposed to be gone, graduated, transferred to other schools. The building had been empty for months, hadn't it? Jessica's radio crackled to life. She grabbed it quickly, hoping it was her supervisor checking in. But instead of a familiar voice, she heard Principal Morrison again, clearer now, as if he was standing right next to her. "Jessica, you need to understand something very important. The children never left the building. They're still here, waiting in room 237. And now that you're here, you can help them find their way home." The temperature in the hallway began to drop rapidly. Jessica could see her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Ice began to form on the windows, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like screaming faces. Every door in the hallway began to creak open slowly, one by one, revealing nothing but darkness inside each classroom. But Jessica could hear something moving in that darkness. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of children crying. She ran toward the exit, but when she reached the main doors, they wouldn't budge. Her keys wouldn't work. The electronic locks had somehow engaged themselves, trapping her inside with whatever was haunting Blackwood Academy. The intercom system activated one final time. This time, it was a different voice entirely. Deep and human, something that had never been human at all. "Welcome to detention, Jessica. Class is now in session, and the lesson today is very simple. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave." The lights went out completely, plunging the academy into absolute darkness. In that darkness, Jessica could hear them coming. Footsteps in the hallways, children's laughter echoing through the building, and underneath it all, the sound of something much larger moving through the corridors, something that had been waiting in room 237 for someone new to join the eternal class. Jessica's screams joined the chorus of voices that would forever echo through the halls of Blackwood Academy, where detention lasts forever, and the final bell never rings. The last thing she heard before everything went silent was the intercom crackling to life one more time. "Class dismissed. Please remember to turn in your homework to the teacher in room 237. Have a wonderful eternity, students." And in the morning, when the school board arrived to check on their new security guard, they found nothing but an empty building, a security uniform folded neatly on the floor, and one last message written in frost on the windows. "She's with US now." The intercom system had been disconnected for years, but somehow, somewhere in the walls of Blackwood Academy, Principal Morrison's voice can still be heard making announcements to students who will never graduate, never grow up, and never ever leave. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you might hear them too. The old brick building of Westfield Academy had witnessed countless generations of students come and go. But tonight, as thunder rolled across the darkening sky, 5 students would discover that some secrets are meant to stay buried forever. James Martinez pressed his face against the cold glass of the classroom window, watching the last teacher's car disappear into the October evening. The parking lot lights flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows across the empty spaces below. "Great. Just fantastic," muttered Victoria Chen, slumping back in her chair. "Thanks to your brilliant idea of staying late for the science project, we're officially trapped." The automatic doors had locked at 6 p.m. sharp, just as they always did. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar halls of their school seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Dmitry Volkov stood near the door, rattling the handle with increasing desperation. "My father will kill me if I'm not home by 8. He has anger issues." "Calm down," said Jasper Williams, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "The night janitor will be here soon. Mr. Thompson always arrives around 7. Isabella Rodriguez looked up from her textbook, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. "You mean old Thompson? That creepy guy who never talks to anyone? I've seen him watching students from the basement windows. There's something seriously wrong with that man." A distant sound echoed through the empty corridors. Not footsteps exactly, but something heavier, something being dragged across the linoleum floors. James felt his stomach tighten. "Did you guys hear that?" They all froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, rhythmic scraping that seemed to move with purpose through the maze of hallways below. "It's probably just Thompson setting up his cleaning equipment," Victoria whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Dimitri's face had gone pale. "In Russia, we have stories about men who work alone in dark places. They change, become something else." "Don't be ridiculous," Jasper snapped, but he moved away from the door. "This is just a normal school with a normal janitor." The lights in their classroom flickered once, twice, then steadied. In the momentary darkness, Isabella could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. But when the lights returned, the corridor was empty. "We need to find another way out," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The emergency exits in the gym might still be unlocked." Victoria shook her head. "Those are alarmed. The moment we open them, the whole security system activates." "Better than staying here," Dimitri muttered, glancing nervously at the door. The scraping sound had stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. It pressed against them like a living thing, making their ears ring and their hearts pound. Isabella closed her textbook with a soft thud. "My grandmother used to tell me about places that hold on to darkness, places where terrible things happened, and the evil just stays." "What kind of terrible things?" James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 30 years ago," Isabella continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "there was a student here named Christopher Hayes. A quiet kid, always being bullied. One night, he stayed late to work on a project, just like us. The next morning, they found him in the basement, dead." Victoria scoffed, but her hands were shaking. "That's just an urban legend. Every school has stories like that." "The official report said suicide," Isabella went on, ignoring the interruption. "But the janitor who found him, old Mr. Patterson, he saw things that night. Things that made him quit and never speak about it again. They say Christopher didn't kill himself. They say something in this school killed him." "And what happened to Patterson?" Dimitri asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "He disappeared 6 months later. They found his apartment empty, like he'd just vanished into thin air. That's when they hired Thompson." Jasper laughed, but it sounded forced and hollow. "So you're suggesting our janitor is some kind of supernatural killer? Come on, Isabella. This is real life, not a horror movie." A new sound interrupted them. Footsteps in the hallway, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, too deliberate. And between each step, that scraping noise, as if something was being dragged behind the walker. The footsteps stopped directly outside their classroom door. They all held their breath, staring at the frosted glass panel that showed only vague shadows from a hallway beyond. A dark shape stood motionless on the other side, tall and unnaturally thin. Then, very slowly, the door handle began to turn. "Nobody move," James whispered, his voice barely audible. The handle turned completely, but the door didn't open. Instead, they heard a low chuckle from the hallway, deep and rasping, like the sound of old leaves being crushed underfoot. "Students," came a voice through the door. It was Thompson, but his usual mumbled speech was different now. Clearer, more confident, more dangerous. "I know you're in there." Victoria pressed herself against the back wall. "We're not supposed to be here," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll just leave now and—" "Oh, but you can't leave," Thompson interrupted, and they could hear the smile in his voice. "The doors are locked, all of them, and I have the only keys." The shadow outside the door moved closer to the glass. Even through the frosted panel, they could see that something was wrong with Thompson's silhouette. His arms seemed too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You see," Thompson continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality, "I've been waiting for another group like Christopher's friends. They stayed late too, 30 years ago. Thought they were so clever, so special. But they learned the truth about this place, about what lives in the basement." Dimitri grabbed James's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now, there's a fire escape ladder outside the window," Jasper whispered, pointing to the far wall. if we can get it open quietly. Oh, I wouldn't try that. Thompson's voice drifted through the door, as if he could hear their whispered conversation. The ladder's been broken for years. Rusty bolts. One wrong step, and it's a 3-story drop to the concrete below. Isabella's textbook slipped from her trembling hands and hit the floor with a loud bang. The shadow outside the door jerked toward the sound. Butterfingers. Thompson chuckled. Christopher's friend Jenny was clumsy too. Always dropping things, making noise. Made it easy to track her through the halls. What happened to them? Victoria found herself asking, though every instinct told her she didn't want to know. They played a game with me, Thompson replied. Hide and seek. I counted to 100 while they ran through the school, looking for a way out. But there's no way out after dark. This place, it changes when the sun goes down. The lights in their classroom flickered again, staying off longer this time. In the darkness, they could hear Thompson's keys jingling softly in the hallway. I gave them a fair chance, he continued when the lights returned. More than Christopher got. He thought he was safe in the basement, working on his little science project. But the basement is MY domain. That's where the old boiler used to be, before they renovated, where they bricked up the tunnels, where they try to hide the bodies. James felt ice water flowing through his veins. Bodies. This school is built on an old cemetery, Thompson said, his voice now coming from a different position outside the door, as if he was pacing back and forth. They moved most of the graves when they built Westfield Academy, but some were forgotten, left behind, and the dead don't like being forgotten. The scraping sound resumed, moving away from their door and down the hallway, but Thompson's voice seemed to follow them even as his footsteps retreated. The game begins in 10 minutes, he called out, his words echoing off the empty walls. I'll count to 100 just like before. Try to find a way out. Try to survive until morning. But remember, in the darkness, I can see everything. And I'm not the only one hunting tonight. His laughter faded as he disappeared deeper into the school, leaving them alone with the weight of his words and the terrible certainty that their ordinary Tuesday evening had become something far more sinister. Victoria looked around at her classmates' terrified faces. Okay, she whispered. What's our plan? We stick together, James said firmly. No matter what happens, we don't split up. Dimitri nodded grimly. In horror movies, people who split up always die first. This isn't a movie, Jasper protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Isabella stood up slowly, her legs shaking. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from them. We need weapons, flashlights, and a way to communicate if we get separated. I thought we just agreed not to split up, Victoria said. Sometimes you don't get a choice, Isabella replied darkly. From somewhere deep in the building, they heard Thompson's voice begin to count. 1, 2, 3, move, James hissed, and they burst into action. The classroom door opened with a soft click, revealing the empty hallway beyond. The fluorescent lights stretched endlessly in both directions, humming with an electrical buzz that seemed louder than before. 4, 5, 6. They crept toward the stairwell, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The school felt different in the darkness, larger somehow, as if the familiar walls had stretched and shifted while they weren't looking. The gym, Dimitri whispered. If we can reach the emergency exit. 7, 8, 9. Isabella grabbed Victoria's arm. Look at the walls. They all stopped, following her gaze. Along the hallway walls, barely visible in the dim light, were dark stains. Old stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. 10, 11, 12. Those weren't there before, Jasper said, his voice cracking slightly. Maybe we just never noticed, Victoria replied, but she didn't sound convinced. They reached the stairwell and began their descent toward the first floor. The steps creaked ominously under their weight, each sound seeming to echo through the entire building. 13, 14, 15. He's counting really slowly, James observed. Good, Dimitri muttered. Gives us more time. But as they reached the first floor landing, They realized that time might not be their biggest problem. The hallway ahead of them was completely dark. All the lights were out, creating a wall of impenetrable blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. 16, 17, 18. We need flashlights, Isabella whispered. The science lab, Victoria said suddenly. There are emergency flashlights in the supply cabinet. They changed direction, moving carefully through the darkened corridors. The beam from Jasper's phone flashlight created a small circle of light that only made the surrounding darkness seem more oppressive. 19, 20, 21. As they walked, they began to notice other changes. Classroom doors that had been closed were now standing open, revealing glimpses of disturbed desks and overturned chairs. The trophy case near the principal's office was shattered, its contents scattered across the floor. This place really does change, Victoria whispered. 22, 23, 24. They reached the science lab and quickly located the emergency supplies. 3 heavy-duty flashlights, a first aid kit, and a box of flares that some previous teacher had stored for outdoor experiments. Better than nothing, James said, distributing the flashlights. 25, 26, 27. Isabella pocketed several flares. These might come in handy if we need to create a distraction. Or signal for help, Dmitri added hopefully. 28, 29, 30. With their new equipment, they felt slightly more confident as they headed toward the gymnasium. The multiple flashlight beams pushed back the darkness, revealing more disturbing details about their transformed school. The hallway walls now bore scratch marks, deep gouges in the plaster as if something with claws had been dragging itself along the corridors. And everywhere, those dark stains that none of them wanted to identify. 31, 32, 33. Almost halfway, Victoria noted. They reached the gym and pushed open the heavy double doors. The vast space beyond was filled with an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant sound of Thompson's counting. 34, 35, 36. Their flashlight beams swept across the empty basketball court, illuminating something that made them all freeze in terror. In the center of the gym floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were 5 sets of school uniforms. Empty uniforms, as if their previous owners had simply vanished from within them. 37, 38, 39. Christopher and his friends, Isabella whispered. The uniforms were old-fashioned, the style from 30 years ago, and in the center of the circle, carved deep into the wooden floor, was a single word, welcome. 40, 41, 42. We need to leave, Dmitri said, backing toward the doors. Right now. But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked. Thompson stood in the doorway, no longer the familiar hunched figure they knew. He seemed taller now, his limbs elongated and wrong, his face hidden in shadow despite their flashlight beams. 43, 44, 45. But I'm not finished counting yet, he said in that same sing-song voice. The game hasn't officially begun. Behind him, other shapes moved in the darkness of the hallway. Tall, thin figures that walked with the same unnatural gait as Thompson. 46, 47, 48. Run, James breathed. They scattered toward the emergency exit, but as Isabella had predicted, it was sealed tight. The door wouldn't budge despite their combined efforts. 49, 50, 51. Thompson and his companions entered the gym slowly, methodically, as if they had all the time in the world, which perhaps they did. The basement, Victoria gasped. There might be another way out through the basement. That's where he wants us to go, Dmitri protested. Do we have a choice? She shot back. 52, 53, 54. They found a service door behind the gym bleachers and wrenched it open. A narrow staircase led down into absolute darkness, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something that reminded Isabella of her grandmother's stories about things that lived in dark places. 55, 56, 57. One by one, they descended into the basement, their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The basement was larger than they'd expected. A maze of storage rooms, maintenance areas, and forgotten corridors that seemed to extend far beyond the footprint of the school above. 58, 59, 60. We're halfway, Jasper whispered, but his voice echoed strangely in the underground space, as if the basement was much larger than it appeared. They moved carefully through the maze, looking for any sign of an exit. Instead, they found evidence of Thompson's previous victims. Personal belongings scattered in dark corners, backpacks and textbooks from different eras, all bearing the stains of whatever fate had befallen their owners. 61, 62, 63. How many students has he killed? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. All of them. Came a new voice from the darkness ahead. Every single one who stayed too late. A figure stepped into their flashlight beams. It was a student, or had been once. His clothes were from the 1990s, his face pale and drawn, his eyes reflecting their light like a cat's. 64, 65, 66. Christopher, Isabella whispered. The figure nodded slowly. I've been waiting so long for someone to find me, to help me stop him. You're dead, Dmitri stammered. Death is different here, Christopher replied. This place traps souls, feeds on them. Thompson isn't just a janitor. He's the guardian of something much older, much hungrier. 67, 68, 69. What do we do? James asked. Christopher pointed deeper into the basement, toward a corridor they hadn't explored yet. The old boiler room. That's where it all began, where the first students died, back when this was just a small schoolhouse. If you can destroy the source, you can break the cycle. 70, 71, 72. What source? Victoria demanded. The bones, Christopher said simply. The original graves they built the school over. Thompson serves them, feeds them fresh souls. But if the bones are destroyed... 73, 74, 75. They followed Christopher through the winding corridors, passing more evidence of Thompson's decades-long reign of terror. The basement seemed to go on forever, as if the school's foundation extended deep into the earth itself. 76, 77, 78. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. Christopher gestured for them to open it. 79, 80, 81. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber dominated by an ancient stone altar. Arranged around it were dozens of skeletal remains, some ancient, others more recent. And standing guard over it all was a figure that might once have been human. 82, 83, 84. The first janitor, Christopher whispered. Patterson. He didn't disappear. He was transformed, like Thompson will be eventually, like all of them. The skeletal figure turned toward them, its empty sockets somehow still conveying malevolent intelligence. 85, 86, 87. The flares, Isabella said suddenly, pulling them from her pocket. Fire. We need fire. 88, 89, 90. They heard Thompson's footsteps on the basement stairs, accompanied by the scraping sound and something else now. The moaning of many voices, all the students who had been trapped in this place over the decades. 91, 92, 93. Isabella lit the first flare, its red light casting hellish shadows across the bone-filled chamber. The skeletal figure of Patterson recoiled, raising bony arms to shield itself from the flames. 94, 95, 96. Now, Christopher shouted, and they rushed forward, throwing flares onto the altar and the surrounding bones. 97, 98, 99. The ancient remains caught fire immediately, as if they had been soaked in gasoline. Patterson's skeleton crumbled to dust, and throughout the basement, they could hear screams of rage and pain as decades of evil began to unravel. 100. Thompson burst into the chamber just as the last of the bones turned to ash. But instead of the elongated monster they expected, he looked like a normal man again, confused, frightened, and very much human. Where am I? he stammered, looking around at the burning chamber in bewilderment. Christopher smiled, his ghostly form beginning to fade. "Thank you," he whispered. "Finally we can rest." The basement shuddered and groaned around them as decades of supernatural corruption began to collapse. Cracks appeared in the walls, and chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling. "Run!" James shouted, grabbing Thompson's arm. The confused janitor stumbled alongside them as they raced through the collapsing basement toward the stairs. Behind them, the chamber filled with fire and smoke as 90 years of accumulated evil burned away. The voices of trapped souls filled the air, not screaming now, but singing, celebrating their long-awaited freedom. They burst up the stairs and into the gym, gasping and coughing. The school around them was returning to normal, the scratches fading from walls, the dark stains disappearing, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like fog before the morning sun. Thompson looked around in confusion. I remember now. The basement. Something was down there, making me do things. Horrible things. But it's gone now, isn't it? Victoria nodded, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's over. The emergency exit, which had been sealed moments before, now opened easily. Cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the promise of safety and freedom. As they walked out into the parking lot, they found that only an hour had passed since they'd been trapped. Their parents were just arriving, worried but not yet panicked. "Where have you been?" James's mother demanded. "We've been calling the school." "Working late on a project," he replied, which was technically true. Thompson stood beside them, still looking dazed. I think I need to find a new job," he said quietly. "Somewhere with more windows and fewer basements." Isabella looked back at the school building, now looking perfectly normal under the parking lot lights. "Some secrets should stay buried," she murmured. "What did you say, dear?" her mother asked. "Nothing, Mom. Just glad to be going home." As they drove away, none of them noticed the small memorial plaque near the school's entrance, which now bore 5 additional names. Christopher Hayes and his 4 friends, finally remembered and honored after 30 years of being forgotten. The night janitor position at Westfield Academy remained vacant for the rest of the school year. And strangely, the building seemed to clean itself, floors mopped, trash emptied, windows sparkling, as if grateful spirits were finally able to rest in peace. But sometimes, late at night, students claimed to see a friendly figure in the hallways, not threatening or dangerous, just making sure everyone got out safely before the doors locked for the evening, because some guardians protect the living, and some secrets are worth keeping. The old brick walls of Westfield Academy had witnessed many secrets over its 100-year history, but none quite like what happened on that October evening when 5 students found themselves trapped inside after hours. It began with a simple detention. Nothing more than 30 minutes of quiet reflection in room 204 for talking during Mr. Peterson's chemistry lecture. Jessica Williams from Toronto, Oliver Thompson from Manchester, Chloe Anderson from Sydney, Benjamin Davis from New York, and Lucas Schmidt from Berlin had all earned their place in that dimly lit classroom as autumn shadows stretched across the campus. The school felt different after 4 o'clock. The bustling hallways that once echoed with hundreds of footsteps now carried only the whisper of settling wood and the distant hum of old radiators. Mrs. Crawford, the detention supervisor, had stepped out 20 minutes earlier, promising to return shortly. That was 45 minutes ago. "Where is she?" Jessica muttered, glancing at her phone. No signal. Again, Oliver stood and walked to the tall windows that faced the courtyard. The October sun was setting fast, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. "Probably forgot about us. Typical. We should just leave," Chloe suggested, her Australian accent cutting through the stillness. "What's she going to do? Give us another detention?" Benjamin was already packing his backpack when the sound hit them. Beep, beep, beep. The fire alarm's shrill cry pierced the silence like a knife through silk. All 5 students froze, their hearts suddenly pounding in unison with the relentless electronic shriek. "Fire drill," Lucas asked in his careful English, though his German accent made the words sound uncertain. After hours? Jessica shook her head. That doesn't make sense. Beep, beep, beep. The sound seemed to grow louder, more urgent. Following protocol drilled into them since elementary school, they moved toward the door. But when Oliver turned the handle, it didn't budge. It's stuck, he said, pulling harder. Let me try. Benjamin joined him, both boys yanking on the handle with increasing desperation. The door remained sealed. Beep, beep, beep. The windows, Chloe said, rushing back to the tall panes of glass. She pushed against the metal frames, but they were the old-fashioned kind that had been painted shut decades ago. My phone still has no signal, Jessica reported, her voice rising with the first notes of panic. Lucas was examining the door more carefully. Look at this, he said, pointing to the hinges. These screws, they look fresh, like someone has been working on them recently. Beep, beep, beep. The alarm continued its maddening rhythm, but now they noticed something else. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway speakers, like it should during a normal drill. It was coming from inside the room, from the walls themselves. That's not possible, Oliver whispered. Benjamin ran his hands along the walls, searching for hidden speakers. His fingers found something unexpected near the blackboard. A small rectangular device, barely visible, mounted flush against the painted brick. There's something here, he called out. Beep, beep, beep. As they gathered around Benjamin, the alarm suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. In that crushing quiet, they could hear their own breathing, their own heartbeats, and something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside their locked door. Jessica pressed her ear to the door. Mrs. Crawford? She called out hopefully. The footsteps paused, then began again, but this time they seemed to circle the room. Impossible, since room 204 was on the second floor with no balcony or fire escape. Oliver's face had gone pale. Guys, I don't think that's Mrs. Crawford. Chloe was backing away from the windows. The footsteps are coming from outside, but we're on the second floor. Beep. Just one beep this time. Sharp and clear. Then another. Beep. And another. Beep. But the rhythm was different now. Slower. More deliberate. Like a countdown. Lucas was frantically searching his backpack. I have a multi-tool. Maybe I can work on these door hinges. As he began unscrewing the ancient hardware, Benjamin noticed something that made his blood run cold. The small device he'd found wasn't just a speaker. It was a camera. A tiny red light blinked steadily, indicating it was recording. Someone's watching us, he whispered. The others turned to look, and in that moment of distraction, the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed the room. In the pitch black, they could hear each other's panicked breathing, but worse than that, they could hear the footsteps again. Only now they weren't just outside the windows or in the hallway. They were inside the room with them. Jessica's voice came out as barely a whisper. Everyone stay together. Don't move. But as she spoke, they could feel a presence moving between them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in seconds. Their breath began to mist in the sudden cold. Beep, beep, beep. The alarm returned, but now it was accompanied by something else. A voice, distorted and electronic, speaking through the same speakers. Detention. Extended. Oliver felt around frantically for his phone's flashlight. When the weak beam finally cut through the darkness, what they saw made them all scream. The walls of room 204 were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Pictures of students who had served detention in this very room over the decades. But these weren't normal school photos. These were images of students in distress. Frightened faces. Tears. Expressions of pure terror. And at the center of it all, 5 fresh photos of themselves, taken just moments ago. How is this possible? Chloe's voice cracked with fear. The electronic voice came again, clearer this time. Welcome to permanent detention. Lucas had managed to remove one of the door hinges, but when he pulled, the door still wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was holding them captive. That's when Jessica noticed the most horrifying detail of all. In the photographs on the walls, she could see the same room, but from different time periods. The clothing styles of the students changed from decade to decade, but the expressions of fear remained constant. "Look at the dates," she gasped, pointing to small numbers in the corners of some photos. 1987, 1995, 2003, 2011, 2019. Every few years, a new set of students, all trapped in the same room, all with the same expression of growing terror. Benjamin was studying the pattern more closely. It's always 5 students, always on an October evening, always during detention. The beeping stopped again, replaced by a sound that chilled them to their bones. Laughter. Cold, mechanical laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "We need to get out of here now," Oliver said, abandoning any pretense of calm. Working together, they managed to remove all the door hinges, but when they tried to lift the door away, it wouldn't move. It was as if it had become part of the wall itself. The temperature continued to drop. Frost began forming on the windows, despite the mild October evening outside. That's when Chloe made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind one of the photographs, she found an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragic fire at Westfield Academy claims 5 students." The date was October 15th, 1952. 5 students were trapped in room 204 during a fire alarm malfunction. She read aloud, her voice shaking. The alarm system had been tampered with, and the door had been sealed from the outside. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Lucas grabbed the clipping from her hands. "But that was over 70 years ago. What does this have to do with us?" The electronic voice answered for him. "Every 7 years. 5 students. The debt must be paid." Benjamin was frantically calculating in his head. 1952, 1959, 1966, every 7 years until 2019. That means... When next? Jessica finished the thought. The beeping resumed, but now it was accompanied by something else. The smell of smoke. Not the acrid smell of electrical fire, but the thick, choking smoke of burning wood and paper. The kind of smoke that had filled this very room over 7 decades ago. Oliver was pounding on the door with his fists. "Help! Somebody help US!" But even as he shouted, they could see wisps of smoke beginning to seep through cracks in the walls that hadn't been there before. "The windows," Chloe said desperately. "We have to break the windows." They grabbed chairs and began smashing them against the glass, but the windows remained intact. Not even a crack appeared in the surface. The smoke was getting thicker. The beeping was getting faster. Beep, 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 beep. That's when Lucas noticed something about the photographs on the walls. They were changing. The faces in the pictures were moving, their mouths opening as if trying to speak, their eyes following the 5 trapped students around the room. "They're trying to tell us something," he said. Jessica wiped away tears from the smoke and looked closer. The students in the photographs were all pointing toward the same corner of the room. Following their direction, the 5 students found themselves staring at a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. The bricks were newer, the mortar still relatively fresh. "There," Benjamin said. "Something's behind there." Using Lucas's multi-tool and their combined strength, they began chipping away at the mortar. The smoke was getting thicker, and they could hear the crackle of flames somewhere in the walls. As they broke through the newer section of wall, they found a small cavity. Inside was a metal box, old and corroded but still intact. Oliver pulled it out and forced it open. Inside were documents, blueprints of the school, and a journal. Property acquisition files. Jessica read quickly through the smoke. Someone wanted to buy the school's land, but the school board wouldn't sell. The journal told the rest of the story. Written in the careful handwriting of someone from the 1950s, it detailed a plan to stage accidents at the school, to create enough tragedy and bad publicity that the board would be forced to sell. The fire in 1952 hadn't been an accident. It had been murder. 5 students died so someone could buy this land, Chloe said, coughing from the smoke. The beeping suddenly stopped. The smoke began to clear. and the electronic voice spoke one final time, but now it sounded different. Younger. More human. Thank you for finding the truth. The photographs on the walls began to fade. The supernatural cold lifted, and with a loud click, the door to room 204 swung open. The 5 students ran into the hallway, gasping for fresh air. Behind them, they could hear the sound of the old building settling, as if a great weight had been lifted from its foundations. When they looked back into room 204, it was just a normal classroom again. Empty desks, a blackboard, and afternoon sunlight streaming through clean windows. Mrs. Crawford found them in the hallway 20 minutes later, apologizing profusely for her delay. She seemed genuinely confused when they asked about the fire alarm. "What fire alarm?" she said. "We haven't had a drill today." The 5 students exchanged glances, but said nothing. Some truths were too strange to share. That night, Jessica researched the property records for Westfield Academy. She found that in 1952, a development company had indeed tried to buy the school's land. After the tragic fire that killed 5 students, the company had withdrawn their offer and dissolved shortly after. The owner's name was listed as Crawford Development Corp., Mrs. Crawford's grandfather. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a small story about the discovery of human remains during renovation work in the school's basement. 5 skeletons, believed to be from the 1950s, had finally been found and would receive proper burial. The fire alarm system at Westfield Academy was inspected and found to be functioning perfectly. Room 204 was converted into a memorial library, dedicated to the 5 students who died in 1952. The names were engraved on a plaque by the door: Thomas Wilson, Margaret Foster, David Chun, Catherine Murphy, and James Rodriguez. The 5 students who survived that October evening never spoke about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, they would each receive a text message with no sender. Just 2 words: "Thank you." And in room 204, now peaceful at last, books were read and knowledge was shared. The only sound that ever disturbed the quiet was the gentle whisper of turning pages and the soft footsteps of students who finally, after 70 years, could rest in peace. The fire alarm at Westfield Academy never malfunctioned again. But sometimes, on October evenings, when the sun sets just right, visitors to the Memorial Library report seeing 5 figures in old-fashioned clothing, standing by the windows, smiling and waving goodbye. The children of Blackwood Academy, still waiting for someone to help them find their way home. The skeletal figure turned toward them, its empty sockets somehow still conveying malevolent intelligence. 85, 86, 87. "The flares," Isabella said suddenly, pulling them from her pocket. "Fire. We need fire." 88, 89, 90. They heard Thompson's footsteps on the basement stairs, accompanied by the scraping sound and something else now: the moaning of many voices, all the students who had been trapped in this place over the decades. 91, 92, 93. Isabella lit the first flare, its red light casting hellish shadows across the bone-filled chamber. The skeletal figure of Patterson recoiled, raising bony arms to shield itself from the flames. 94, 95, 96. "Now," Christopher shouted, and they rushed forward, throwing flares onto the altar and the surrounding bones. 97, 98, 99. The ancient remains caught fire immediately, as if they had been soaked in gasoline. Patterson's skeleton crumbled to dust, and throughout the basement, they could hear screams of rage and pain as decades of evil began to unravel. 100. Thompson burst into the chamber just as the last of the bones turned to ash. But instead of the elongated monster they expected, he looked like a normal man again, confused, frightened, and very much human. Where am I?" he stammered, looking around at the burning chamber in bewilderment. Christopher smiled, his ghostly form beginning to fade. "Thank you," he whispered. "Finally we can rest." The basement shuddered and groaned around them as decades of supernatural corruption began to collapse. Cracks appeared in the walls, and chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling. "Run," James shouted, grabbing Thompson's arm. The confused janitor stumbled alongside them as they raced through the collapsing basement toward the stairs. Behind them, the chamber filled with fire and smoke as 90 years of accumulated evil burned away. The voices of trapped souls filled the air, not screaming now, but singing, celebrating their long-awaited freedom. They burst up the stairs and into the gym, gasping and coughing. The school around them was returning to normal, the scratches fading from walls, the dark stains disappearing, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like fog before the morning sun. Thompson looked around in confusion. I remember now. The basement. Something was down there, making me do things. Horrible things. But it's gone now, isn't it? Victoria nodded, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's over. The emergency exit, which had been sealed moments before, now opened easily. Cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the promise of safety and freedom. As they walked out into the parking lot, they found that only an hour had passed since they'd been trapped. Their parents were just arriving, worried but not yet panicked. "Where have you been?" James's mother demanded. "We've been calling the school." "Working late on a project," he replied, which was technically true. Thompson stood beside them, still looking dazed. I think I need to find a new job," he said quietly. "Somewhere with more windows and fewer basements." Isabella looked back at the school building, now looking perfectly normal under the parking lot lights. "Some secrets should stay buried," she murmured. "What did you say, dear?" her mother asked. "Nothing, Mom. Just glad to be going home." As they drove away, none of them noticed the small memorial plaque near the school's entrance, which now bore 5 additional names. Christopher Hayes and his 4 friends, finally remembered and honored after 30 years of being forgotten. The night janitor position at Westfield Academy remained vacant for the rest of the school year. And strangely, the building seemed to clean itself, floors mopped, trash emptied, windows sparkling, as if grateful spirits were finally able to rest in peace. But sometimes, late at night, students claimed to see a friendly figure in the hallways, not threatening or dangerous, just making sure everyone got out safely before the doors locked for the evening, because some guardians protect the living, and some secrets are worth keeping. Detective William Rodriguez had seen enough crime scenes to last 3 lifetimes, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what waited inside Lincoln High School that cold October morning. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. A janitor named Frank Peterson had discovered something that made him drop his keys and run screaming from the building. When Officer Jennifer Walsh arrived first on scene, she took one look through the main hallway window and immediately called for backup. By 7:15 a.m., the entire school was surrounded by police cars, their red and blue lights painting the brick walls like some twisted carnival. But let me tell you what really happened that night. What the newspapers never printed. What the school board buried deeper than any grave. It all started 3 weeks earlier when Principal Dorothy Hamilton decided to upgrade the school's ancient security system. The old cameras were practically useless, grainy black and white relics from the 1990s that couldn't catch a clear image of anything. So she hired Thompson Security Solutions to install a state-of-the-art digital surveillance network. 24 cameras. Night vision, motion detection, HD recording. The installation crew, led by a quiet man named David Chun, worked after hours for 5 straight days. They ran cables through walls, mounted cameras in every hallway, every classroom, every corner where students might gather. The main server room was established in the basement, a windowless concrete chamber that hummed with electronic equipment. "This system will see everything," Chin told Principal Hamilton as he handed over the access codes. "Every angle, every movement. Nothing escapes these cameras." He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The first week passed normally. The cameras caught the usual teenage mischief. Christopher Adams spray-painting lockers after basketball practice. Twin sisters Amanda and Jessica Miller sneaking out during lunch break. Kevin O'Brien dealing stolen exam papers behind the gymnasium. Standard stuff that every high school deals with. But then technology coordinator Robert Thompson noticed something odd while reviewing the footage. In the recordings from camera 15, which monitored the third-floor east hallway, there were strange visual distortions, dark shapes that moved independently of any person or object in the frame. At first, he assumed it was a technical glitch, maybe interference from the old electrical wiring. That's when things started getting wrong. On Monday night, the cameras recorded maintenance worker George Mitchell doing his regular rounds at 11:30 p.m. The footage shows him mopping the floors, emptying trash cans, checking locks. Perfectly normal. But at 11:47 p.m., camera 8 captured something that shouldn't have been possible. George was in the basement when suddenly his reflection appeared in the mirror at the end of the first-floor hallway. Not George himself, just his reflection, moving independently, waving at the camera, smiling with a grin that was far too wide for any human face. George, meanwhile, was still in the basement, completely unaware that his mirror image was wandering the school above him. The next morning, George couldn't remember finishing his shift. He was found sitting in the parking lot at 6 a.m., staring blankly at the school building with no memory of how he got there. When they showed him the footage, he turned pale and quit on the spot. But the cameras kept recording. Tuesday night brought something worse. The motion sensors triggered around midnight, alerting the monitoring company that someone was in the building. When security guard Patricia Williams arrived to investigate, she found all the doors locked and no signs of forced entry. The alarm system showed no breaches. Yet the cameras had recorded over 2 hours of activity. In the footage, dozens of students were walking the hallways. Students that Principal Hamilton recognized immediately. They were graduates from years past. Some from 5 years ago. Some from 10. Some from 20 years ago. Wearing outdated clothes and hairstyles that belonged to different decades. They moved through the school like they owned it, opening lockers that had been reassigned multiple times, sitting in classrooms arranged with furniture that had been replaced years ago. They attended classes taught by teachers who had long since retired or died, and they all looked directly into the cameras, every single one, with hollow, knowing stares that seemed to pierce right through the lens and into the souls of anyone watching. The most disturbing part was the audio. The cameras had picked up conversations, but when the IT department enhanced the recordings, they realized the voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any human language at all. The sounds were guttural, primal, like some ancient dialect that predated civilization itself. Principal Hamilton wanted to shut down the system immediately, but the school board overruled her. They claimed the footage was the result of old electromagnetic interference mixing with the new digital equipment. They hired an electronics expert named Dr. Michael Foster to debug the system. Dr. Foster spent 3 days analyzing the recordings and the camera hardware. On Thursday evening, he called Principal Hamilton with his preliminary findings. "The equipment is functioning perfectly," he reported. "There's no technical malfunction. Whatever these cameras are recording is actually happening in your school." That night, Dr. Foster decided to stay late and observe the building in person. He positioned himself in the main office with a clear view of the central hallway and a direct feed to all camera monitors. At exactly 12:33 a.m., the temperature in the office dropped 20 degrees in under a minute. The computer screens began flickering, and every camera feed showed the same impossible image simultaneously. A young girl, maybe 16 years old, standing in every single hallway at the same time. She had long brown hair and wore a Lincoln High School uniform from the 1960s. But her face was wrong. The features kept shifting, morphing, like her skull was made of liquid beneath the skin. Dr. Foster watched in horror as this girl walked through solid walls, appeared and disappeared at will, and spoke directly to the cameras in that same inhuman language they'd heard before. But this time, the translation software on his laptop managed to decode fragments of what she was saying. The watchers become the watched. The seers become the seen. The school remembers all who walk its halls, and we remember the school. Then she pointed directly at Dr. Foster through the camera feed, even though she was supposedly in the hallway 50 feet away. She smiled, and when she did, her mouth opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth, that belonged to no earthly creature. Dr. Foster ran. He grabbed his equipment and fled the building, never to return. His final report was just 2 words: evacuate immediately. But the school board refused. They couldn't afford to lose enrollment or face the legal liability of shutting down based on supernatural claims. They decided to continue operating and simply restrict access to the security footage. That was their first mistake. The second mistake was hiring night security guard Thomas Anderson to replace Patricia Williams, who had also quit after viewing the recordings. Thomas was a skeptic, a former military police officer who didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings or any of that nonsense. When Principal Hamilton briefed him about the unusual camera activity, he laughed it off as the overactive imaginations of stressed school staff. "Show me some spooks," he said confidently. "I'll show them what real fear looks like." On his first night, Thomas set up a command post in the security office with full access to all camera feeds. He brought coffee, snacks, and a loaded pistol, planning to catch whatever pranksters were responsible for the haunting of Lincoln High School. The first few hours passed quietly. Thomas reviewed the controversial footage and found rational explanations for everything. The moving reflections were obviously video manipulation. The ghostly students were probably projections or holographic tricks. The temperature drops could be explained by faulty heating systems. At 1:15 a.m., his confidence began to waver. Camera 12, which monitored the science wing, showed a classroom full of students taking an exam. Normal enough, except that particular classroom had been empty for renovations since August. The desks had been removed. The floor had been torn up. There was literally nothing in that room except bare concrete and exposed pipes. Yet the camera clearly showed 30 students sitting at desks that didn't exist, writing on papers with pencils that cast no shadows, supervised by a teacher whose face kept changing every time the camera angle shifted. Thomas checked the other feeds. Camera 7 showed the gymnasium packed with spectators watching a basketball game, complete with cheerleaders and a pep band. But the gymnasium had been locked since 6 p.m., and the motion sensors showed no activity in that area. Camera 19 displayed the library filled with students studying, but every book on every shelf was blank. The students were reading pages that contained no words, turning sheets of pure white paper with intense concentration. And in every single feed, scattered throughout the crowds of impossible students, Thomas began to recognize faces. Students who had died in accidents over the years. A boy named Daniel Murphy, who had been killed in a car crash in 2018. A girl named Lisa Chun, who had died of leukemia in 2019. Teacher Harold Patterson, who had suffered a heart attack in his classroom 3 years ago. They were all there, all watching, all waiting. At 1:47 a.m., Thomas noticed that several of the students in different camera feeds were staring directly at him, not at the cameras, at him. Their eyes tracked his movement as he walked around the security office. When he waved his hand, some of them waved back. That's when the temperature dropped again, and Thomas realized he wasn't alone in the building. Footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the office. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the movement of anyone visible on the camera feeds. The sound grew closer, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Thomas drew his weapon and called out, "Who's there? This is security. Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. The humming continued. On the monitors, every camera feed now showed the same thing. Hundreds of students, teachers, and staff members from across decades of Lincoln High School history, all standing motionless and staring directly at the security office. Some were transparent. Some flickered like bad television reception. Some appeared solid and real, but they all had the same expression. Hungry anticipation, like predators watching cornered prey. Thomas backed against the wall and kept his gun trained on the door. "I know someone's out there. Come out where I can see you." That's when he heard the voice, not from the hallway, but from the security monitors themselves. Every speaker in the system activated simultaneously, filling the room with a sound that was part whisper, part scream, part electronic static. "We see you. Thomas, Anderson. We have been watching. We are always watching. The cameras show us everything. And now we show the cameras everything. The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in, casting everything in hellish red illumination. On the monitors, the impossible crowds of students began moving toward the camera positions, walking through walls and closed doors as if they didn't exist. Thomas ran for the exit, but the hallways had changed. They stretched impossibly long, with doors that led to classrooms he'd never seen before. Lockers lined walls that shouldn't have existed. The geometry of the building had become fluid, dreamlike, defying all logic and physical laws. Behind him, the footsteps multiplied. Not just one set, but dozens, hundreds, all moving in perfect synchronization. The humming grew louder, resolving into words in that alien language the cameras had recorded. Thomas burst through what should have been the main entrance, but found himself in the gymnasium. He tried another door and ended up in cafeteria. Every exit led to a different room inside the school. There was no escape. The security cameras, still functioning on emergency power, recorded everything that happened next. They captured Thomas running through impossible corridors, while phantom students reached out with hands that cast no shadows. They recorded him screaming as he fell through floors that existed only on camera and climbed stairs that led to ceilings with no rooms above. They documented his gradual realization that the school itself had become alive, aware, and hungry for new residents to join its ever-growing collection of trapped souls. The final footage shows Thomas standing in the main hallway at exactly 3:33 a.m., no longer running, no longer fighting, just standing still with the same hollow expression that all the other phantom students wore. His eyes vacant, his mouth slightly open, his body present but his mind somewhere else entirely. When the morning staff arrived and found the security office empty, they assumed Thomas had abandoned his post, but the cameras told a different story. They showed him standing motionless in various locations throughout the building, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by the ghostly student body that only the surveillance system could see. Principal Hamilton tried one last time to convince the school board to shut down the camera system, but they refused. The district had invested too much money in the equipment, and they weren't going to write off a six-figure security installation because of technical glitches and staff superstitions. That's when the cameras started recording during school hours. At first, it was subtle. Students would appear in two places at once. Teachers would be caught on camera in classrooms they weren't scheduled to be in. The lunch count would show more meals served than students present. Then living students started reporting strange experiences. They'd see classmates in the bathroom mirrors who weren't actually there. They'd hear their names called by voices that belonged to people who hadn't attended the school in years. They'd find notes in their lockers written in handwriting that matched perfectly with that of deceased students from the school's records. The tipping point came on October 13th, when sophomore Jake Williams was reviewing footage for the school newspaper and discovered something that made his blood freeze. In every single camera feed from the past month, standing in the background of normal school activities, were the ghosts. Hundreds of them. They attended classes alongside living students. They ate lunch in the cafeteria. They walked the halls between periods. They had always been there, invisible to human eyes, but perfectly visible to the digital cameras. And they were growing stronger. The footage showed them becoming more solid, more present, more real with each passing day. What had started as transparent shapes and flickering images had evolved into entities that could interact with the physical world. Locker doors opened by invisible hands. Books fell from shelves with no one nearby. Chalk wrote messages on blackboards in empty classrooms. The messages were always the same. We are here. We remember. The school remembers. Jake tried to show the footage to his journalism teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, but when she viewed it, she saw only normal school activities. The ghosts were invisible to her. They were invisible to everyone except the cameras and, apparently, Jake himself. That night, Jake stayed late in the computer lab to make copies of the most disturbing footage. He planned to upload it to the internet, to force the school board to acknowledge what was happening. But as he worked, he began to feel watched. Not by the living security cameras, but by something else. Something older. Something that had been observing Lincoln High School long before the digital surveillance system was installed. In the reflection of his computer monitor, Jake saw her. The girl from the 1960s, with the shifting face and impossible mouth. She was standing directly behind him. But when he turned around, nothing was there. "You can see us now," her voice whispered through the computer speakers. "The cameras have opened your eyes to our world. Soon, you'll join us in the watching." Jake grabbed his laptop and ran for the parking lot, but the school's exit doors wouldn't open. Electronic locks engaged and disengaged randomly. Fire alarms triggered, then shut off. The building's computerized systems had developed a mind of their own, and that mind didn't want Jake to leave with evidence of what was happening. He finally escaped through a window in the art room, cutting his arms on broken glass as he squeezed through. But even as he drove away, Jake could see the school building in his rearview mirror, and every window glowed with the pale blue light of active security cameras. The cameras that never stopped watching. The cameras that had learned to see beyond the physical world. The cameras that had become a bridge between the living and the dead. Jake never made it home that night. His car was found the next morning in the school parking lot, key still in the ignition, laptop missing. The surveillance footage showed him arriving at 11:45 p.m. and walking calmly into the building, where he joined Thomas Anderson in the main hallway, standing motionless with that same empty expression. But here's the part that Detective Rodriguez couldn't explain to his superiors. The part that made him request a transfer to a different district. The part that still wakes him up in cold sweats. When the janitor Frank Peterson discovered the crime scene that October morning, he hadn't found bodies or blood or any signs of violence. What he'd found were the security monitors in the main office, all displaying the same impossible image. Every camera in the school was showing the same view. The main hallway, packed with every student, teacher, and staff member who had ever died while connected to Lincoln High School. Decades of ghosts, all standing together, all staring directly into the cameras with those hollow, hungry expressions. And in the front row, clear as day, were Thomas Anderson and Jake Williams, no longer alive, but not quite dead, trapped forever in the electronic purgatory of the surveillance system. The cameras had indeed seen too much. They had seen beyond the veil between life and death, and in doing so, they had created a prison where human souls could be captured, stored, and endlessly observed by something that should never have been given the power to watch. Principal Hamilton finally got her wish. The school board voted unanimously to shut down the camera system and seal the server room. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The bridge between worlds had been established, and closing the cameras didn't close the connection. Lincoln High School closed permanently 3 weeks later, officially due to structural concerns and budget constraints. The building stands empty now, but neighbors report strange lights moving behind the windows at night, electronic sounds emanating from the walls, and sometimes, just sometimes, faces pressed against the glass from the inside. The security company, Thompson Security Solutions, went out of business within a month. Every school that had installed their camera systems reported similar unexplained phenomena: equipment malfunctions, staff disappearances, students who claimed to see people who weren't there. As for Detective Rodriguez, he keeps a simple rule now. He never looks directly into security cameras, because sometimes, late at night when he's reviewing case footage, he swears he can see something looking back at him from the other side of the lens. Something that remembers every face it's ever recorded. Something that adds each viewer to its collection of watched souls. Something that turns the watchers into the watched, just as that ghostly girl had promised. The cameras may be gone from Lincoln High School, but the appetite they awakened remains. It spreads through fiber optic cables and wireless signals, infecting every surveillance system it touches, turning our modern world of constant observation into a feeding ground for entities that exist between the digital and the dead. So remember this: the next time you notice a security camera tracking your movement, or when you feel those electronic eyes following you through a store, or when you catch your reflection behaving strangely in a monitored space, The cameras are always watching. But now, thanks to Lincoln High School, they're not the only ones watching back. And somewhere, in the electronic void between surveillance and spirit, Thomas Anderson and Jake Williams are still standing in that hallway, eternal witnesses to the horror they helped unleash, forever trapped in a prison made of pixels and paranormal hunger. The security camera that saw too much continues to see everything, and it's still recording. Oakwood Academy stood like a monument to educational excellence. Tall brick walls reaching toward gray autumn skies, pristine hallways that echoed with the footsteps of ambitious students. For 23 years, Jessica Williams had walked these same corridors as a literature teacher, believing she knew every secret the old building held. She was wrong. It was October 15th when the first drops appeared. Jessica arrived early that Tuesday morning, her coffee still steaming as she unlocked classroom 204. The familiar smell of old books and chalk dust greeted her, but something else lingered beneath. Something metallic. "Strange," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the morning silence. There, right in the center of the classroom, 3 perfect crimson drops stained the polished wooden floor. Jessica knelt down, her fingers hovering inches above the mysterious stains. They were still wet, but that was impossible. The custodial staff had cleaned every room thoroughly the night before, and Jessica had locked the door herself. No one could have entered without a key. She grabbed paper towels from her desk, quickly wiping away the evidence before her first period students arrived. As she worked, a chill ran down her spine. The drops seemed to resist her efforts, as if they had somehow bonded with the wood itself. "Good morning, Miss Williams," called out Amanda Chin, her brightest student, as she bounced through the doorway with her usual enthusiasm. "Morning, Amanda," Jessica replied, forcing a smile while discreetly disposing of the stained towels. The day proceeded normally. 3rd period British literature, 5th period creative writing, 7th period advanced placement English. But throughout each class, Jessica found her eyes drifting to that spot on the floor, expecting to see the stains return. They didn't. Not until the next morning. Wednesday brought more blood. This time, 5 drops formed a peculiar pattern, like the points of an invisible star. Jessica documented everything with her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she captured the evidence. The drops were larger now, darker, and they seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "I'm losing my mind," she muttered, but deep down she knew this was real. By Thursday, the pattern had expanded. 7 drops now, arranged in a perfect circle around the original 5. Jessica measured the distances with the ruler from her desk, each drop exactly 4 inches from the next. Mathematical precision that made her skin crawl. She decided to stay late that evening, hiding in the supply closet across the hall with a perfect view of her classroom door. If someone was playing an elaborate prank, she would catch them in the act. The hours crawled by. 9 p.m. became 10 p.m., then 11. The school settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the distant humming of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of settling wood. At 11:47 p.m., Jessica saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. Tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned school uniform. The figure began walking toward her classroom, each footstep echoing like a gunshot in the empty corridor. Jessica pressed herself deeper into the supply closet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the crack in the door, she watched as the figure stopped directly in front of classroom 204. The door, which Jessica had locked with her own key, swung open with a soft creak. The figure disappeared inside. Jessica waited, counting each second that felt like an eternity. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Finally, the figure emerged and glided back down the hallway, vanishing into the shadows near the main staircase. When Jessica finally found the courage to check her classroom, she discovered 13 drops of blood arranged in concentric circles, still warm to the touch. "You need to know the history," whispered Dorothy Mackenzie, the elderly school librarian, when Jessica approached her the next morning. Dorothy had worked at Oakwood Academy for 43 years, and her eyes held secrets that made Jessica's skin crawl. "What history?" Jessica pressed, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Dorothy led her to the basement archives, where dust-covered boxes held decades of school records. With shaking fingers, she pulled out a newspaper clipping dated October 15th, 1952. Local student disappears from Oakwood Academy. The headline made Jessica's stomach drop. The accompanying photograph showed a young girl, maybe 16 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. The name beneath read, Charlotte Blackwood, missing since October 15th. She was found 3 days later, Dorothy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. In classroom 204. What is now your classroom? The official report said she had fallen and struck her head, but those who saw the scene knew better. Jessica's hands trembled as she read further. Charlotte had been discovered in the center of the room, surrounded by her own blood that had somehow formed a perfect geometric pattern on the floor. The medical examiner found no evidence of a fall, no head trauma, no explanation for the massive blood loss. The case was quietly closed, filed away as an unfortunate accident. But that's not the worst part, Dorothy whispered, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. Charlotte isn't the only one. Every 25 years, on October 15th, someone in that classroom, someone dies. Jessica felt the world spinning around her. Every 25 years. 1952, Charlotte Blackwood. 1977, Michael Anderson, a substitute teacher found with his throat cut. 2002, Jennifer Walsh, a senior student who stayed after school for extra help. And now it's 2027. Jessica finished, her voice barely a whisper. Dorothy nodded grimly. The pattern never breaks, never fails, and it's always in that same spot, right in the center of room 204. That afternoon, Jessica couldn't concentrate on her lessons. Her students noticed her distraction, her nervous glances toward the center of the classroom, her hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Miss Williams, are you feeling all right? Asked David Thompson, a concerned senior in her AP class. I'm fine, just tired. She lied, but her eyes never left that cursed spot on the floor. The blood drops had multiplied again. 21 now, forming an intricate mandala of crimson that seemed to shift and breathe when she wasn't looking directly at it. The pattern was almost complete, and Jessica could feel something terrible building in the air around her. After dismissing her final class, Jessica remained in the empty room, staring at the blood pattern that now covered nearly 3 feet of floor space. The drops had begun to connect, forming thin red lines that created a complex geometric design unlike anything she had ever seen. As darkness fell outside, the temperature in the classroom began to drop. Jessica's breath started to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and she could hear something that made her soul scream in terror. Footsteps, coming from inside the walls. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking through the very structure of the building. Plastered dust began falling from the ceiling, and the blood pattern on the floor started to glow with an otherworldly red light. Charlotte, Jessica whispered, her voice cracking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Then slowly, deliberately, the classroom door slammed shut with a bang that echoed through the empty school like thunder. The lock clicked into place, trapping Jessica inside with whatever presence had claimed this room decades ago. The blood on the floor began to bubble and hiss, rising from the wooden planks like crimson steam. In that vapor, Jessica saw a face forming, the same face from the newspaper photograph. Charlotte Blackwood, but twisted with rage and supernatural fury. You're my place, the apparition spoke, its voice like breaking glass and dying screams. Jessica pressed herself against the locked door, her hands frantically searching for any means of escape. But the windows had somehow sealed themselves shut, and the walls seemed to be closing in around her. Please, I didn't know. I'm sorry, Jessica begged, but Charlotte's ghostly form was already reaching toward her with fingers that looked like bloody bones. Every 25 years, someone must pay, Charlotte hissed, her eyes now glowing the same crimson as the blood beneath Jessica's feet. Someone must join me in this eternal classroom, this prison of learning and death. Jessica felt icy fingers wrap around her throat, lifting her off the ground with impossible strength. The room spun around her as she gasped for air, her vision blurring as darkness crept in from the edges. But then, something unexpected happened. A warm light filled the classroom, pushing back the supernatural cold and causing Charlotte's grip to loosen. Jessica crashed to the floor, coughing and gasping as she looked up to see another figure materializing in the doorway. It was Dorothy Mackenzie, but not the elderly librarian Jessica knew. This Dorothy appeared younger, stronger, and her eyes blazed with determination and ancient knowledge. "Enough," Dorothy commanded, her voice carrying power that made the very air vibrate. "The cycle ends now." In her hands, Dorothy held an old leather journal filled with symbols and incantations that hurt Jessica's eyes to look at directly. She began chanting in a language that sounded older than time itself, and with each word, Charlotte's form became less solid, less real. "You cannot banish me," Charlotte shrieked, her voice growing fainter. "I am bound to this place, to this room, to this pattern." "The pattern was never yours," Dorothy replied calmly, still chanting as she stepped into the classroom. "You were its first victim, but you don't have to be its guardian. Let go. Charlotte, find your peace." For a moment, Charlotte's expression softened. The rage and madness faded from her ghostly features, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. The blood on the floor began to fade, the geometric pattern dissolving back into ordinary wooden planks. I'm so tired," Charlotte whispered, her voice now sounding like the scared 16-year-old girl she had once been. "I know," Dorothy said gently. "Rest now. Your torment is over." With a final grateful smile, Charlotte Blackwood faded away, finally free from the curse that had bound her to classroom 204 for 75 years. Jessica remained on the floor, trembling and gasping as the supernatural cold lifted from the room. The blood pattern was completely gone now, leaving only clean wooden planks that looked as if they had never been stained. "How did you know?" Jessica asked as Dorothy helped her to her feet. Dorothy smiled sadly, closing the leather journal and tucking it inside her jacket. "I've been a guardian of this secret for 43 years, waiting for the right moment to break the cycle." Charlotte needed someone to show her the way out, someone who understood the difference between being trapped by the past and being freed by forgiveness. "Will she come back?" "No," Dorothy said with certainty. "The pattern is broken. The curse is lifted. Classroom 204 is just a room now, nothing more, nothing less." As they walked out of the classroom together, Jessica looked back one final time. In the dim hallway light, she could swear she saw a figure standing by the windows, not Charlotte's tormented ghost, but the peaceful spirit of a young girl finally going home. The next morning, Jessica returned to classroom 204 with a mixture of relief and sadness. The events of the previous evening felt almost like a dream, but the absence of any blood drops on the floor confirmed that everything had been terrifyingly real. Her students filed in for first period, chattering and laughing as they always did, completely unaware that their classroom had been the site of one of the most profound supernatural encounters in the school's history. "Good morning, Miss Williams," called Amanda Chen, settling into her usual front row seat. "Good morning, Amanda," Jessica replied, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been in days. "Today, we're going to study a very special piece of literature about the power of forgiveness and how sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that set us free." As Jessica began writing on the whiteboard, she noticed something that made her smile. There, in the exact center of the classroom, where the blood pattern had once appeared, a single ray of sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the floor with warm, golden light. Charlotte Blackwood had finally found her peace, and classroom 204 could begin a new chapter in its long history. The cycle was broken, the curse was lifted, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between classes, Jessica could swear she heard the sound of gentle laughter, carried on a breeze that smelled of autumn leaves and new beginnings. The blood on the classroom floor was gone forever, replaced by something far more powerful: hope. At Blackwood Academy, a prestigious boarding school nestled deep in the Canadian wilderness. There was one classroom that remained forever locked. Room 237 on the third floor had been sealed for exactly 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting. Well, except for James Morrison, the night security guard who walked those halls every evening, his flashlight beam never quite reaching the corners, where shadows seemed to gather and whisper. The story began on a rain-soaked October morning when M.R.S. Charlotte Winters, the most beloved English teacher Blackwood had ever known, simply vanished. One moment she was preparing her lesson on Gothic literature in a faculty lounge, her steaming cup of Earl Grey growing cold on her desk. The next moment, she was gone. Her car remained in the parking lot, keys still dangling from the ignition. Her purse sat untouched in her classroom. Even her beloved leather-bound copy of Edgar Allan Poe's complete works lay open on her desk, as if she had simply evaporated mid-sentence. The police investigation lasted 6 grueling months. Detective Margaret Hayes from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police interviewed every student, every teacher, every janitor who had access to the building. Security cameras showed Mrs. Winters entering the school at exactly 7:23 a.m., but no footage existed of her leaving. It was as if the building itself had swallowed her whole. What made the disappearance even more disturbing was what happened in the weeks that followed. Students began reporting strange occurrences in room 237. Benjamin Clark, a senior student, swore he heard the distinct sound of chalk scratching against the blackboard at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. The sound would continue for precisely 43 minutes before falling into an unnatural silence that seemed to press against your eardrums. Olivia Thompson, the head librarian, discovered that books in the school library were being mysteriously rearranged. Every morning, she would find a single book moved to the center of the main table. Always a different book. Always something Mrs. Winters had assigned in her classes. The Turn of the Screw, The Haunting of Hill House, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Each book would be open to a specific page, with a single sentence underlined in red ink that seemed to appear overnight. Principal David Ashworth made the decision to permanently seal room 237 after a series of increasingly disturbing events. Substitute teachers hired to take over Mrs. Winters' classes refused to enter the room. Jonathan Miller, a veteran educator with 25 years of experience, lasted exactly 47 minutes in that classroom before running out, his face pale as winter snow, mumbling about cold spots that moved and whispers in dead languages. The cleaning staff, led by Patricia Wong, reported that no matter how thoroughly they cleaned room 237, they would return the next morning to find a single message written on the blackboard in perfect, elegant handwriting. The same message day after day. Class is now in session. But the most chilling discovery came 3 years after Mrs. Winters' disappearance. Thomas Bradley, the school's maintenance supervisor, was conducting routine repairs in the ceiling above room 237 when his flashlight illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the narrow space between the ceiling tiles and the floor above, he found Mrs. Winters' grade book. Every page was filled with entries dated years into the future, listing the names of students who had never attended Blackwood Academy. Their final grades were all marked with the same notation: absent permanently. The school board tried to maintain normalcy, but whispers spread through the student body like wildfire. Alex Johnson, the student newspaper editor, began investigating the school's history and discovered that Blackwood Academy had been built on the site of an old tuberculosis sanatorium. Records from the 1920s showed that dozens of children had died in the building that once stood where room 237 was now located. The final entry in the sanatorium's logbook, dated October 13, 1927, simply read, "All students have joined the eternal classroom." As years passed, the legend of Mrs. Winters and room 237 became a rite of passage for Blackwood students. Dares were made, bets were placed, but no one who spent a full night outside that locked door ever spoke about what they experienced. Nathan Cooper, now a successful lawyer in Toronto, still wakes up in cold sweats, unable to forget the sound of 27 voices reciting Hamlet's soliloquy in perfect unison. even though the classroom had been empty for years. Rachel Burns, the current English department head, refuses to discuss what happened during her one and only attempt to enter room 237 with the master key 5 years ago. School security footage from that night shows her approaching the door at 11:47 p.m. and then standing completely motionless for 7 hours and 16 minutes before suddenly collapsing. When she regained consciousness, her hair had turned completely white, and she spoke only in perfect iambic pentameter for 3 weeks. The most recent incident occurred just last semester when Christopher Adams, a sophomore with a reputation for fearlessness, managed to slip into the sealed classroom during a fire drill. He was found 36 hours later in the school's bell tower, catatonic and clutching a piece of chalk worn down to a tiny stub. His notebook was filled with the same sentence written over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. "She's still teaching. She's still teaching. She's still teaching." Security guard James Morrison, now in his 60th year, has announced his retirement at the end of this term. In his final report, he wrote, "There are some mysteries that aren't meant to be solved, some doors that should never be opened, and some teachers who refuse to accept that class has been dismissed." On quiet October nights, when the Canadian wind howls through the old stone corridors of Blackwood Academy, students and faculty alike report the same phenomenon. The sound of chalk on blackboard drifts from room 237, accompanied by a woman's voice reciting the opening lines of The Raven. "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary." And somewhere in that locked classroom, where dust motes dance in moonbeams that filter through windows no living person has cleaned in 7 years, Mrs. Charlotte Winters continues her eternal lesson. Her grade book is never full, because there's always room for one more student in the class that never ends. The administration has tried everything. Less salt, holy water, even a professional exorcist brought in from Boston. But Mrs. Winters remains faithful to her calling, dedicated to her profession. After all, the best teachers never really retire. They just wait for their next class to begin. And at Blackwood Academy, enrollment is always open for those brave enough to take a seat in room 237, where the lesson plan includes subjects not found in any earthly curriculum: advanced fear, intermediate terror, and a master class in the fine art of never leaving school. The brass nameplate still hangs outside the sealed door, tarnished now but still readable: MRSC Winters, English Literature. And below it, someone has added a small sign in that same elegant handwriting: Office Hours, Eternity. Because at Blackwood Academy, some teachers never clock out. They simply disappear into their work, forever. The old Westfield High School had been abandoned for 3 months now. Every classroom door was locked tight, every window sealed, every entrance barred shut. The lockdown orders were clear. No one was allowed inside the building until further notice. But someone or something didn't seem to care about those rules. Detective James Crawford received the call on a Tuesday morning in October. The security company monitoring the school's cameras had noticed something disturbing. Night after night, the motion sensors were triggered in the main hallway, but whenever they checked the footage, they saw nothing but empty corridors bathed in eerie moonlight. "This is the 4th week in a row," explained Officer Patricia Williams as she met James at the school's front entrance. "The sensors go off at exactly 2:17 a.m. every single night. Same time, same location. But here's the strange part: the cameras show absolutely nothing." James examined the heavy chains wrapped around the entrance doors. The locks were intact, covered in dust and rust. No signs of forced entry anywhere. He walked around the perimeter of the building, checking every possible way someone could get inside. Everything was sealed tight. "Show me the footage," he said, following Patricia to their patrol car, where she had a laptop ready. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. from the previous night. The hallway appeared on screen long, dark, filled with shadows cast by emergency lighting. Then suddenly, the motion sensor triggered. A red light blinked on the recording system, but the hallway remained completely empty. "Wait." James leaned closer to the screen. "Play that again." As the footage replayed, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were no visible figures, no movement of any kind, but at the exact moment the sensor triggered, the dust particles in the air began to swirl and dance, as if something was walking through them, disturbing their natural settling pattern. "You see it too," Patricia whispered. "It's like invisible footsteps." That night, James decided to investigate from inside the building. He obtained special permission from the school district and positioned himself in the main office, which had a clear view of the hallway through glass windows. At exactly 2 a.m., he turned off all the lights and waited in complete darkness. The school felt different at night. The silence was so thick it seemed to press against his ears. Every small sound, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through gaps, seemed amplified in the emptiness. 2:15 a.m. James checked his watch, the green glow cutting through the blackness. His heart began to beat faster. 2 more minutes. 2:16 a.m. He could hear his own breathing, loud and unsteady in the suffocating quiet. 2:17 a.m. The motion sensor light in the hallway suddenly flickered on. James pressed his face against the glass window, staring into the brightly lit corridor. Nothing. No movement. No figures. Just an empty hallway filled with harsh white light. But then he heard it, clear as day. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the hallway. The sound of shoes against linoleum floor, coming closer and closer to the main office. James's hands trembled as he reached for his flashlight. The footsteps continued, steady and methodical, as if someone was walking directly toward him. The sound stopped right outside the office door. James held his breath, listening with every fiber of his being. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, 3 soft knocks on the office door. James's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he aimed it at the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the empty building. No answer, just silence. He slowly approached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Another series of knocks, this time more insistent. James yanked the door open, flashlight raised, ready to confront whatever was on the other side. The hallway was completely empty, but the footsteps started again, this time moving away from him, continuing down the corridor. James followed the sound, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls as he tried to track the invisible presence. The steps led him past empty classrooms, past trophy cases filled with dusty awards, past bulletin boards covered in forgotten announcements from months ago. The footsteps stopped at the far end of the hallway, right in front of room 237. James approached slowly, his heart pounding. The door to room 237 was slightly ajar, even though all classroom doors were supposed to be locked tight. Inside the classroom, James discovered something that made his investigation take a terrifying turn. On the whiteboard, written in what appeared to be chalk, were the words, "We never left." The next morning, James returned with a full investigation team. They discovered that room 237 had been the location of a tragic incident 20 years ago. During a severe winter storm, 5 students, David Thompson, Lisa Anderson, Michael Chun, Jennifer Rodriguez, and Robert Johnson, had been trapped in the school overnight when the heating system failed. They were found the next morning, all 5 having died from hypothermia. The school records showed that the incident had been covered up, the families quietly compensated, and the story buried to protect the school's reputation. The students had died in room 237, the very room where the mysterious message had appeared. As James dug deeper into the investigation, he learned something even more chilling. The lockdown that had closed Westfield High School hadn't been implemented for health reasons, as everyone believed. It had been put in place because multiple staff members had reported strange phenomena in the weeks leading up to the closure. Teachers found their classrooms rearranged overnight. Janitors heard voices in empty hallways. The school principal, Thomas Mitchell, had received numerous complaints about cold spots, unexplained sounds, and the feeling of being watched in certain parts of the building. The final piece of the puzzle came when James interviewed Mrs. Helen Foster, who had been the school's head custodian for 30 years. She revealed that the disturbances had started exactly 20 years after the incident in room 237, and they always occurred at 2:17 a.m., the exact time the 5 students had been pronounced dead. "They're not trying to scare anyone," Mrs. Foster explained, her voice shaking with emotion. "They're trying to tell us they're still here, still waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to them." James realized that the invisible footsteps, the motion sensors, the message on the whiteboard, it was all a desperate attempt by 5 young spirits to make their presence known. They had been forgotten, their story erased, their deaths covered up. The lockdown had given them the opportunity to finally make themselves heard in the empty, silent hallways where they had died. On his final night at school, James returned to room 237. This time, instead of trying to catch or confront the spirits, he spoke directly to them. He acknowledged their presence, spoke their names aloud, and promised that their story would be remembered. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the motion sensors triggered one last time. But this time, instead of fear, James felt a strange sense of peace wash over the building. The footsteps came again, but they were different now, lighter, more at rest. They moved through the hallway one final time before fading into silence. The next morning, the school district announced that a memorial would be placed in the main hallway, honoring the 5 students who had lost their lives 20 years ago. The lockdown was lifted, but Westfield High School was never quite the same. Some say that on quiet nights, when the building is empty and still, you can still hear the echo of footsteps in the hallway. But they're no longer the desperate, pleading steps of lost souls. They're the peaceful footsteps of 5 young people who finally found their way home. The motion sensors at Westfield High School never triggered again at 2:17 a.m. But every year, on the anniversary of that tragic winter night, school staff report finding fresh flowers placed quietly outside room 237, as if left by invisible hands in remembrance of those who never got to graduate, never got to leave those hallways behind, but who finally found peace in being remembered. The old brick building of Westfield Academy had witnessed countless generations of students, but none quite like the class of 2019. What happened that autumn afternoon would forever change how people looked at room 237 on the 3rd floor. It was a Tuesday in late October when Professor Williams first noticed something was wrong. The mathematics class had just ended, and students were filing out for their next period. But as the last student left, Williams heard a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. He glanced at his watch. 3:17 p.m. Exactly. The window faced the school courtyard, 3 stories above ground. There was no tree, no ladder, nothing that could explain the sound. Williams approached the glass cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty classroom. Nothing, just the empty courtyard below and the gray October sky above. "Must be the wind," he muttered, though there wasn't even a breeze that day. The next Tuesday, Williams arrived early to room 237. He had been thinking about that sound all week, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching from outside that window. As the class settled in, he kept glancing at the clock. 3:16 p.m. 3:17 p.m. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the entire class heard it. 23 students turned their heads toward the window simultaneously, their faces growing pale as they stared at the empty space beyond the glass. "Professor," whispered James, a usually confident senior from Manchester, there's nothing out there." But the tapping continued, steady, insistent, as if invisible fingers were drumming against the window pane, demanding to be let in. Williams felt his throat go dry. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. The students didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their books and fled, leaving Williams alone with that terrible sound. Tap, tap, tap. He forced himself to walk to the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, but behind his reflection, he could swear he saw something else, a shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. The tapping stopped. Williams pressed his face against the cold glass, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. That's when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. There were fingerprints on the outside of the window. Small ones. Child-sized. But that was impossible. The window was 3 stories up, with no way to reach it from the outside. Word spread quickly through Westfield Academy about the haunted classroom. Students began avoiding room 237, and teachers requested schedule changes. But the school administration dismissed it as mass hysteria. "Old buildings make strange noises," explained Principal Davidson, a stern woman from Toronto. "It's probably just the pipes or the heating system." But then Olivia Chun, a sophomore from Vancouver, decided to investigate. She had always been fascinated by the paranormal, and the mystery of room 237 was too intriguing to ignore. On the following Tuesday, Olivia hid in the storage closet adjacent to the classroom. She waited, watching through the crack in the door as the clock on the wall ticked toward 3:17 p.m. The room was empty, silent. Then, tap, tap, tap. Olivia's heart pounded as she watched the window. At first, she saw nothing. Then, gradually, as if materializing from thin air, she began to see a figure outside the glass. It was a child, a little girl in an old-fashioned school uniform, floating in midair outside the third-floor window. Her face was pressed against the glass, her small fists tapping urgently on the pane. The child's eyes were wide with terror, and her mouth was moving as if she was trying to scream, but no sound came through the glass. Only that persistent tapping. Olivia stumbled backward, knocking over a mop bucket with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, and the tapping stopped abruptly. When Olivia looked back at the window, the child was gone. That night, Olivia researched the history of Westfield Academy. What she found in the local archives made her hands tremble as she read. In 1987, a 7-year-old girl named Lucy Patterson had fallen from the third-floor window of what was now room 237. She had been attending an after-school program, and somehow, the window latch had given way while she was looking out at the courtyard below. Lucy had died instantly. The accident had been ruled tragic, but unavoidable. The window had been repaired, safety measures put in place. Life at the school had continued. But according to the newspaper article, Lucy had fallen at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Olivia realized with growing horror that the anniversary was approaching. October 23rd, the same day Lucy had died 32 years ago. She tried to warn the school administration, but Principal Davidson refused to listen. "Miss Chun, I will not have you spreading these ridiculous ghost stories," she said firmly. "Room 237 will remain in use as scheduled." But on October 23rd, something changed. M.R. Harrison, the new chemistry teacher from Dublin, was sitting up for his afternoon lab when the tapping began. But this time, it wasn't just soft percussion against the glass. The window began to shake violently in its frame. The glass cracked in spider web patterns, and a cold wind somehow began blowing through the sealed classroom, scattering papers and extinguishing the Bunsen burners. Harrison ran from the room, nearly colliding with several students in the hallway. "The window," he gasped, pointing back at room 237. "Something's trying to get in." The students gathered in the hallway could hear it too. The violent shaking, the creaking of the window frame, and underneath it all, a sound that made their skin crawl. Crying, the desperate sobbing of a child. Janitor Murphy, an elderly man from Glasgow who had worked at the school for 20 years, pushed through the crowd of students. "I've heard enough," he said grimly. "That poor wee lass has been trying to tell us something for weeks." He walked into room 237, ignoring the protests of the gathered crowd. The window was shaking so violently now that it seemed ready to shatter completely. Murphy approached the window slowly, his weathered hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Lucy," he called out softly. "Lucy Patterson. Is that you, child?" The shaking stopped immediately. The crying continued, but softer now, less desperate. "What is it you need, lass?" Murphy asked, pressing his palm against the cracked glass. The crying faded to a whisper, and then, in the condensation on the glass, words began to appear, written by invisible fingers from the outside. Not accident. The blood drained from Murphy's face as more words appeared. Pushed. The hallway fell silent except for the sound of 20 students holding their breath. "He's still here. Murphy stumbled backward as one final word appeared on the glass. Basement. The police investigation that followed revealed horrifying truth. Hidden beneath the school's basement floor, they found the remains of 3 other children who had disappeared from the area over the past 40 years. And living in the abandoned tunnels beneath the school was Harold Wickham, now in his 70s, who had worked as a maintenance worker at Westfield Academy since the 1980s. Wickham had been abducting children for decades, using his knowledge of the school's layout and his master keys to move unseen through the building. Lucy Patterson hadn't fallen from the window. She had been pushed after witnessing Wickham dragging another child into the basement tunnels. Her spirit had been trapped, trying desperately to warn anyone, about the monster who still lurked in the shadows of the school she had died trying to protect others from. After Wickham's arrest, the tapping at the window stopped. Room 237 became quiet once more. But sometimes, on sunny Tuesday afternoons, students passing by the third-floor window catch a glimpse of a small figure in an old-fashioned school uniform, standing peacefully in the courtyard below. She's not tapping anymore. She's not crying. Lucy Patterson is finally at rest, having saved countless other children from a fate she and 3 others had suffered in the darkness beneath Westfield Academy. The heroes aren't always the ones you expect. Sometimes, they're the small voices that refuse to be silenced, even in death. And sometimes, if you listen carefully at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, you can still hear the echo of small fists against glass, reminding us that the truth will always find a way to surface, no matter how long it takes. Whitmore Academy had stood in the remote Vermont hills for nearly a century, its heavy oak doors welcoming generations of students. In the winter of 2019, something happened that changed its reputation forever. It began on a Tuesday evening when the East Wing's heating system failed. The temperature dropped to freezing, and a strange fog drifted through the old brick halls. Students huddled under blankets while the maintenance crew worked on repairs. James Morrison, a senior from Toronto, was in the library when he heard faint voices, children's voices, echoing through the empty corridor. At first, it sounded like whispers carried by the wind, but as the night grew colder, the voices became clearer. "Did you hear that?" he asked his roommate, David Chin. Moments later, both heard it again, light footsteps followed by muffled giggles. It was past midnight. No younger students should have been in that part of the building. Ignoring David's warning, James grabbed his flashlight and opened their door. The hallway stretched before them, lit only by pale moonlight. The air outside was colder than their room, their breath hanging in thick clouds. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood, coming from an abandoned classroom. As they approached room 237, the tapping grew louder. Inside, old desks sat beneath dusty sheets. Several of those sheets were moving. James froze. From beneath the cloth came whispers. "Why did you leave us here? Why didn't anyone come back?" His flashlight flickered. In those brief flashes, he saw pale faces with hollow eyes and blue lips peeking out from under the sheets. The boys bolted. Behind them came the scrape of chairs and the patter of small feet. Back in their room, they found the phone dead. All night, they heard footsteps, whispers in the walls, and faint singing, nursery rhymes from another time. By morning, other students began sharing strange encounters. Handprints appeared on frosted windows. A music box played alone in the music room. Charlotte Webb, normally quiet, claimed a boy named Timothy had appeared at her bed, telling her he and others were trapped in the basement since 1943, when the school housed child evacuees during the war. James, David, and Charlotte found the basement door hidden behind old furniture. Inside, they discovered rows of cots, a logbook from 1943, and entries that told of an illness spreading quickly among 17 children. The last note read, "All children lost. God forgive us. Have sealed the lower chamber." Through a half-open door, they saw a smaller room filled with tiny skeletons and tattered clothes. The temperature dropped. Voices surrounded them. "You found us. Now you must join us." Figures emerged from the shadows, forcing the students to flee up the stairs, stairs that seemed to stretch endlessly. They finally burst into the main hall and went straight to the headmaster, who ordered them never to speak of it. But the hauntings grew worse. Messages appeared on blackboards. Remember us. We want to go home. During the Christmas pageant, the lights failed. In the dim emergency glow, 17 ghostly children stood on stage, singing Silent Night before vanishing, leaving a message in frost. We just wanted to sing too. The truth could no longer be buried. The remains were recovered, given proper burials, and a memorial room was created. The strange sounds never completely faded, but now they brought a feeling of peace. Whitmore Academy's walls still whisper, but no longer with anger, only with the voices of children who are finally remembered. When Thomas Avery became principal of Jefferson High School, he didn't expect his biggest challenge to be the intercom system. For weeks, it had been broadcasting strange, unauthorized announcements in a calm, unfamiliar voice. At first, the messages were odd but harmless. Then they became deeply personal, revealing secrets about students and teachers, even mentioning the dead by name. The voice knew things it shouldn't. Outdated room numbers, decades-old events, private matters no one else could know. One afternoon, long after the last student had left, Thomas stayed behind to record the phenomenon. At exactly 4 p.m., the intercom crackled and spoke directly to him. "Good afternoon, Principal Avery," it said. "I know about the sealed room in the basement, the incident in 1987, and the students who never made it home." The voice identified itself as Harold Winters, a principal who had died decades earlier. Harold explained that something ancient and hungry had lived beneath the school long before it was built in 1962. Every few years, the entity grew hungry and lured students to stay after hours, trapping them inside the building until they disappeared forever. Harold claimed he'd been trying to warn people through the announcements, but could never save them all. That night, Harold told Thomas he could escape if he followed specific instructions: avoid the elevators, take the east wing, find room 237. But when Thomas entered the room, it transformed into a vast underground cavern of black stone. There was no exit, only shifting shadows and something massive moving in the darkness. Harold admitted he'd lied. The room was a gateway to the entity's realm. He had brought Thomas here to confront it. As the creature approached, Harold taught Thomas an ancient incantation carved into the ground long before humans arrived. Fueled not by fear but by anger over the lives it had taken, Thomas spoke the words. The entity recoiled, the cavern cracked, and sunlight began breaking through. Thomas awoke in room 237 as if nothing had happened, morning light streaming in. Harold's fading voice thanked him, warning the peace would only last for years, not forever. As Thomas left, he saw new construction plans, a school expansion directly over where the entity now slept, and he understood that his role as principal was no longer about running a school. It was about keeping its darkest secret buried, because some announcements aren't meant to inform, they're meant to warn.